Stay out of this. You're here to pour water, not think." The words landed cold and precise, slicing through the polished stillness of the $40 million boardroom like a blade against glass. And for a moment, no one moved. Naomi Brooks stood at the far end of the table, a silver tray balanced in her hands, condensation from the water glasses chilling her fingers as the low hum of the air conditioning filled the silence Ethan Cole had just created. His eyes already back on the contract as if she no longer existed, as if she had never existed, just another invisible figure in a pressed uniform moving quietly along the edges of power. The executives around the table shifted slightly, some avoiding her gaze, others watching with faint amusement, their reflections stretching across the glossy black surface like shadows that didn't belong to them. Naomi lowered the tray carefully, each glass making a soft, controlled sound as it met the table, but her eyes didn't follow her hands. They stayed fixed on the document in front of Ethan, on a single paragraph buried halfway down page 14. The words etched into her mind like something she couldn't unsee, couldn't unknow. She inhaled slowly, the scent of polished wood and expensive cologne settling heavy in her chest, and for a second, just 1 second, she considered stepping back, fading into the background the way she had been taught, the way the world expected her to. But something held her there, something stronger than fear, stronger than the weight of every stare in the room. Ethan flipped a page, his pen hovering just above the paper, the deal minutes away from being signed. Millions, no, hundreds of millions of dollars shifting hands with the stroke of a pen, and still no one else saw it. No one else noticed the clause that twisted everything, that turned protection into exposure, that quietly handed control away while pretending to secure it. Naomi's grip tightened just slightly on the edge of the tray, the cool metal pressing into her palm, grounding her, steadying her, and before the doubt could return, before the moment could pass, her voice cut through the room, calm, clear, and impossible to ignore. That clause, it doesn't protect your company. The air changed instantly, like pressure dropping before a storm, every head turning toward her in unison, the silence no longer passive but sharp, alert, waiting. Ethan didn't look up at first, as if the interruption itself didn't deserve acknowledgement, but when he finally did, slowly, deliberately, his expression wasn't anger yet, it was disbelief, the kind reserved for something that didn't fit the order of his world. "Excuse me," he said, his tone low, controlled, the room holding its breath around him. Naomi didn't step back, didn't lower her gaze, her voice steady despite the heat rising in her chest. Page 14, subsection C. The liability shifts entirely to your side if the deal fails under post-signing review. A murmur rippled through the table, subtle but real, like a crack forming beneath the surface. One executive leaned forward, another reached for a tablet, fingers moving quickly, eyes narrowing. Ethan's pen remained suspended midair, unmoving now, his focus no longer on the signature line but on her, really on her, for the first time since she entered the room. And in that suspended moment, with the weight of power pressing down and the truth hanging fragile between them, something unseen began to shift. The silence did not break, it deepened, stretching across the room until even the faint hum of the air system seemed too loud, too intrusive for what was unfolding. Ethan Cole's eyes narrowed slightly, not in anger yet, but in calculation, the kind that came from years of winning, of being the one who always saw further, always knew more, and now, for the first time in a long time, something did not align. He lowered his pen slowly, the soft click against the polished table echoing louder than it should have, and turned the contract toward himself, his gaze scanning the exact section Naomi had pointed out, his fingers brushing lightly over the page as if touch might confirm what his eyes were beginning to suspect. Around him, the executives shifted in their seats, the earlier amusement dissolving into uncertainty, one man adjusting his tie, another leaning closer to his screen, the faint tapping of keys breaking the stillness in uneven rhythms. Naomi remained where she stood, her posture steady, shoulders relaxed but firm, as if she had anchored herself to something deeper than the room, deeper than the power pressing down on her from every direction. She could feel the weight of their stares, the quiet judgment, the disbelief that someone in her position would dare to interrupt, But she did not look away, did not retreat. Her focus fixed on Ethan as he read. Really read now. Not skimming. Not assuming. But tracing each word with growing precision. A subtle change moved through his expression, almost imperceptible. A tightening at the jaw. A pause that lasted a fraction too long. And then another, his breathing slowing as the implications began to unfold in his mind, layer by layer, each one heavier than the last. Across the table, a senior partner cleared his throat softly, as if testing whether it was safe to speak. But no one followed. The room held in a quiet suspension that felt fragile, like glass under pressure. Ethan flipped back a page, then forward again, comparing, cross-checking, his fingers no longer relaxed but pressing harder against the paper, leaving faint impressions that disappeared as quickly as they formed. "Where did you say?" he began, his voice lower now, stripped of its earlier certainty. But he did not finish the question, because he had already found it, the line hidden in plain sight, dressed in language that sounded protective but carried a different weight entirely. Naomi spoke again, not louder, but with a clarity that cut through the tension. "It shifts all post-signing liability to your firm if any regulatory issue arises, even if the origin is external." A quiet ripple moved through the room, sharper this time, more focused, as if the truth had finally found enough space to breathe. Ethan leaned back slightly, just enough to create distance between himself and the document, as if seeing it from another angle might change what it revealed, but it did not. The words remained, unyielding, exact. His gaze lifted slowly, meeting Naomi's across the long stretch of glass and steel, and for a moment, the room disappeared. The hierarchy, the expectations, the unspoken rules, all fading into the background as something else took their place, something quieter, heavier, undeniable. No one laughed now. No one shifted with casual confidence. The earlier dynamic had fractured, replaced by a silence that carried a different kind of weight, one that no amount of authority could easily dismiss. No one spoke, not immediately, because the weight of realization did not arrive all at once. It settled slowly, like dust in sunlight, visible only when the room grew still enough to notice. Ethan's fingers remained on the page, but they no longer moved. The confidence that had once guided every decision now paused in a way that felt unfamiliar, almost foreign, as if the ground beneath him had shifted just enough to make him question his footing. Across the table, a senior analyst leaned forward, adjusting his glasses, his voice tentative when it finally broke the silence. "He is right. I mean, she is right." He corrected quickly, the words catching in his throat as if even acknowledging it required permission. Another executive tapped his tablet again, slower this time, verifying line by line, his expression tightening as the same conclusion formed independently in his mind. The contract, once seen as airtight, now revealed gaps that were not accidents but design, subtle, intentional, dangerous. Naomi stood still, her hands now free at her sides, the tray forgotten on the table behind her, the cool air brushing lightly against her skin, but she barely felt it. Her focus fixed not on their reactions but on the truth that had already settled within her long before she spoke. Ethan exhaled quietly, a controlled breath, but it carried a different weight now, not authority, not certainty, but recalibration. He flipped to the appendix, then back again, connecting clauses, tracing implications, his mind moving rapidly, faster than anyone else in the room, but no longer ahead, now catching up to something that had already been seen. "If this holds," he said finally, his voice measured but no longer dismissive, "we absorb every downstream risk regardless of source." The words hung in the air, heavier than before, because now they were not theory, they were consequence. A faint murmur spread, restrained but undeniable, as the magnitude began to settle across the table. Millions at stake, reputations, control, everything balanced on a line that had almost gone unnoticed. Naomi shifted her weight slightly, not retreating, not advancing, simply holding her ground, her presence no longer peripheral but central in a way no one could ignore. Ethan's gaze lifted again, slower this time, deliberate, studying her not as an interruption but as a variable he had not accounted for, his eyes searching for hesitation, uncertainty, anything that might weaken what she had said, but finding none. There was only steadiness, quiet and unwavering, the kind that did not need volume to be heard. He leaned back further in his chair, the leather creaking softly, a small sound that seemed amplified in the charged stillness. And for a moment he looked away, not at the contract, not at the executives, but toward the wide glass windows stretching across the far wall. The city beyond blurred by reflection, distant and indifferent. Something in his posture shifted, subtle but real, the posture of someone who had just seen a version of the future he had not planned for and could not afford to ignore. When he turned back, the room felt different, the hierarchy less rigid, the assumptions less certain, and in that quiet recalibration, the space between him and Naomi no longer felt defined by distance, but by a single undeniable fact that neither of them needed to say out loud. The room did not return to normal. It shifted into something tighter, more precise, as if every person inside had suddenly become aware of the exact cost of being wrong. Ethan leaned forward again, but this time slower, controlled, his fingers aligning the edges of the contract with a care that felt deliberate, almost surgical. And when he spoke, his voice no longer carried dismissal, it carried weight. "Walk me through it," he said, not looking at anyone else, only at Naomi. A few heads turned. Sharply at that, the subtle shock of authority redirecting itself, of attention moving where it had not been allowed to go before. Naomi did not move immediately, not out of hesitation, but because the moment itself required precision, the kind that could not be rushed, and when she stepped forward, it was quiet, measured, her shoes barely making a sound against the polished floor as she approached the table, stopping just short of the edge, close enough to see the fine print clearly, but still outside the circle that had once excluded her. She reached out, not touching the document at first, her hand hovering slightly above the page as if acknowledging the boundary that still existed. Then gently, carefully, she pointed to the line. "Here," she said, her voice even, steady. "This phrase allows external regulatory interpretation after execution, which means your firm becomes the default liable party if anything is contested." The words flowed without strain, without performance, simply stated, and that made them harder to dismiss. One of the executives shifted in his seat, leaning closer now, his earlier confidence replaced by concentration. Another scribbled notes quickly, the faint scratching of pen on paper filling the spaces between her sentences. Ethan's gaze followed exactly where she pointed, his focus narrowing, absorbing each detail, not interrupting, not correcting, simply listening, something he had not done before. Naomi continued, "It is structured to appear mutual, but it is not. The opposing side retains exit flexibility while your position locks in full exposure." A quiet exhale moved through the room, not dramatic, but collective, as understanding deepened. Ethan's jaw tightened slightly again, but not in resistance, in recognition, the kind that came when a flaw could no longer be rationalized away. He sat back just a fraction, enough to create space, but not distance, his eyes lifting to meet hers again, and this time there was no trace of dismissal left, only a sharp, recalibrated awareness. "Why did no one flag this?" he asked, not loudly, but the question carried across the table with precision. No one answered immediately, the silence that followed heavier than before, because it was no longer about uncertainty, it was about accountability. Naomi did not speak into that silence. She did not need to. Her role was not to accuse, only to reveal, and she had already done that. Ethan's fingers tapped once against the table, a small, controlled motion, then stilled, as if even that movement required reconsideration. He looked back down at the contract, then at the team, then finally at Naomi again, and something subtle but undeniable shifted in the air, not a collapse of power, but a redistribution of it, quiet, precise, and irreversible. The air in the room tightened further, no longer uncertain, but heavy with consequence, as if every second now carried a measurable cost. Ethan's gaze moved slowly across the faces at the table, not searching for answers anymore, but measuring silence, weighing who had missed what, and why, his fingers resting flat against the contract, no longer tapping, no longer moving, just still, as if even motion required justification now. "We pause this," he said finally, his voice calm but final, cutting clean through the tension without force. And for a moment no one reacted, as if the shift from momentum to restraint needed time to register. Then chairs adjusted, subtle movements returning, but not the same as before, not relaxed, not confident, careful. One executive cleared his throat, attempting to recover ground. "We can revise the clause before signing. It does not have to delay." But Ethan raised a hand slightly. Not abrupt, not aggressive, just enough, and the words stopped. Immediately. "We are not revising anything until we understand everything," he said, and the emphasis was quiet, but unmistakable. Naomi remained beside the table, not stepping back, not stepping forward. Her presence now integrated into the space in a way that could not be undone, her eyes moving briefly across the pages again, confirming what had already been seen, not for them, but for herself. Ethan turned toward her once more, the shift in his posture subtle but real, shoulders less rigid. His focus no longer filtered through assumption but through direct attention. "If we had signed," he said, slower now, each word deliberate. "How long before this triggers?" The question landed differently than the ones before, not dismissive, not rhetorical, but open, precise. Naomi answered without hesitation. 30 to 60 days, depending on how quickly external review flags inconsistencies. A quiet murmur followed, sharper this time, the timeline making the risk immediate, tangible, no longer abstract. One of the analysts leaned back, exhaling under his breath, while another shook his head slightly, almost imperceptibly, as if recalculating numbers that no longer held. Ethan nodded once, absorbing it, his eyes drifting briefly back to the contract, then away again, as if he no longer trusted the surface of it, as if every line now required deeper inspection. The room had changed, not dramatically, not loudly, but in a way that settled into the bones of everyone present. The earlier hierarchy softened at the edges, replaced by something more fragile, more real. Naomi shifted her weight slightly, the cool floor steady beneath her feet, the quiet hum of the room now less distant, more present, as if she had stepped fully into a space that had once excluded her. Ethan straightened in his chair, not to reassert control, but to reset it, his voice lower now, more focused. "We rebuild this from the ground up," he said, then paused, his eyes lifting again to meet hers, holding there for a fraction longer than before. "And you are not leaving this room yet." The words were not a command, not exactly, but they carried a different kind of weight, one that no longer dismissed, but recognized, and in that moment, the shift that had begun quietly now stood fully formed, undeniable, and still unfolding. The room did not move forward. It settled into a quiet that felt intentional, as if everyone understood that rushing now would only hide what needed to be seen clearly. The city beyond the glass stretched wide and distant, sunlight reflecting faintly off neighboring towers. But inside, the light felt cooler, sharper, catching the edges of the table, the corners of the contract, the stillness in every posture. Ethan did not speak immediately, and that silence carried more weight than any command he had given before, his hands resting lightly on the table, no longer gripping, no longer asserting, just present, as if he was allowing the moment to exist without control. Naomi remained where she stood, close enough to the table to be part of the conversation, yet not fully seated within it, her breathing steady, her shoulders relaxed, the tension that had once pressed against her now replaced by something quieter, more grounded, as if she had stepped into alignment with something that did not require permission. A faint sound of paper shifting came from across the table, an analyst turning a page slowly, carefully, as if each movement needed to be justified, and the soft rhythm of that motion echoed lightly in the space, marking time in a way that felt almost deliberate. Ethan's gaze moved once more to the contract, but this time he did not read it. He simply looked at it, as if acknowledging what it had nearly become, what it had almost cost, and then his eyes lifted again, not to challenge, not to test, but to understand. "How did you see it?" he asked, the question quiet, direct, stripped of authority, and for the first time, it carried something else, something closer to curiosity than control. Naomi paused for a fraction of a second, not searching for an answer, but choosing how to give it, Her voice, when it came, was calm, unforced. "I have seen structures like this before," she said, her eyes briefly dropping to the page, then back to him. "They rely on language that feels safe, but shifts responsibility in small ways that most people do not question." The room listened, not passively, but with a kind of focus that had not been there before, the kind that came when attention was earned, not assumed. Ethan nodded once, slowly, absorbing not just the explanation, but the clarity behind it. And for a moment, his gaze lingered, not on her uniform, not on her position, but on the certainty in her voice, the steadiness that had not wavered even when the room had turned against her. No one interrupted, no one redirected, the usual flow of hierarchy, replaced by something quieter, more deliberate. And in that stillness, the boundaries that had once defined the space felt less rigid, less certain. Ethan leaned back slightly, the chair moving with a soft, controlled sound, and exhaled, not heavily, not dramatically, but enough to signal a shift within himself, a recalibration that could not be undone. "We almost missed it," he said, not as an accusation, not as a statement to the room, but as an acknowledgement, one that settled between them with a quiet finality. Naomi did not respond immediately. She did not need to. Her presence itself had already answered the question that mattered most. And as the silence returned once more, it no longer felt empty. It felt earned, filled with the weight of what had been revealed and the quiet understanding that nothing in the room would return to what it had been just minutes before. The realization did not arrive with noise. It settled in quietly, but with a precision that could not be ignored, and Ethan felt it fully now, not just as a mistake avoided, but as a failure in his own system, a blind spot that should not have existed, one that had nearly cost him everything. He leaned forward again, slower this time, his hands no longer resting passively, but moving with intent as he closed the contract halfway, not dismissing it, but containing it, as if it no longer deserved the authority it had held minutes ago. His eyes moved across the table, not scanning, not asserting, but acknowledging, and for the first time, there was no expectation of immediate response from anyone else, only a quiet awareness that something fundamental had shifted. Then his gaze returned to Naomi, steady, direct, and different, no longer filtered through hierarchy or assumption, but through recognition. "What else?" he asked, the question simple, but carrying a weight that redefined the room, because it did not challenge her, it invited her. A subtle ripple moved through the executives, a shift in posture, in attention, as the implication settled in, that the voice they had overlooked was now the one guiding the conversation. Naomi did not react to the change in tone, not outwardly. Her expression remained composed, her focus unchanged, but there was a quiet clarity in her eyes, as if she had already accepted something the room was only beginning to understand. She stepped slightly closer to the table, just enough to narrow the distance, and her hand moved again, this time not hesitating above the page, but resting lightly beside it, indicating another section. "There is a secondary clause here," she said, her voice even, precise. "It ties compliance verification to an external audit firm that they select, not you." A faint murmur followed, sharper than before, the pattern emerging more clearly now. Not a single flaw, but a structure designed to shift control incrementally. Ethan's attention locked onto the line she indicated, his brow tightening just slightly as he traced the language. And then he saw it. Not because it was hidden, but because he was finally looking for what had been hidden in plain sight. His jaw set for a brief moment, then released, the tension not building, but dissolving into something more focused. "So they control both the trigger and the verification," he said, not as a question, but as a realization forming in real time. Naomi nodded once, small, controlled, confirming without emphasis, and that quiet confirmation carried more authority than any argument. The room shifted again, deeper this time, the earlier structure of power no longer holding its shape, replaced by something more fluid, more honest, where insight mattered more than position. Ethan leaned back slightly, his eyes still on the page, but his posture no longer defensive, no longer rigid. Instead, it held a kind of clarity, the kind that came when denial was no longer possible. He exhaled slowly, the sound almost inaudible, but enough to mark the moment. And when he looked up again, the distance between him and Naomi no longer felt defined by rank, but by the simple fact that she had seen what he had not. "We would have signed this," he said quietly, not to the room, not even fully to her, but to the truth itself, and in that acknowledgement, something irreversible settled into place. Not dramatic, not loud, but absolute. The moment where power did not disappear, it changed direction. No one challenged it anymore. Not the contract, not the conclusion, and not her. The room had moved past doubt into something quieter, something heavier, and Ethan felt it settle fully. Now, not just as a mistake avoided, but as a moment that demanded a response. He straightened slowly, the movement controlled, deliberate, as if even posture now carried meaning. And when he spoke, his voice was no longer directed at the table, it was directed at her. "Naomi," he said, using her name for the first time, and that alone shifted the air, subtle but undeniable. A few executives glanced at each other, not confused, but aware that something had changed in a way they could not reverse. Ethan's gaze held steady, no longer sharp with authority, but focused with something closer to respect, something earned in real time. "You just saved this company from a mistake we would not have recovered from quickly," he continued, the words measured, not exaggerated, but precise, as if he understood the weight they carried and chose each one carefully. Naomi did not react outwardly. Her posture remained composed, her expression calm, but there was a slight shift in her breathing, a quiet acknowledgement that what had been unseen was now fully recognized. Ethan took a small step away from the table, not creating distance, but closing it in a different way. His attention no longer divided across the room, now centered entirely on her. "I was wrong," he said, simply, without defense, without explanation, and the simplicity of it landed stronger than anything else he had said. The room absorbed it in silence, the kind that followed truth when it was spoken without resistance. One executive lowered his eyes briefly, another leaned back, exhaling softly, the ripple of that admission moving outward without sound. Naomi met his gaze, steady, not vindictive, not triumphant, just present, as if she had not been waiting for the apology, only for the truth to be seen. Ethan paused for a fraction longer, as if recalibrating again, then continued, "I need you to stay." The words came quieter this time, but carried more weight than before, not as a command, not as an order, but as a recognition of value that could no longer be ignored. He glanced briefly at the contract, then back at her. "Not just for this meeting," he added, the implication unfolding slowly, deliberately, but for what comes next. The room shifted again, not with tension, but with a kind of quiet acceptance, as if everyone present understood that the structure they had walked in with no longer applied in the same way. Naomi did not answer immediately, the silence between them stretching just enough to hold the weight of the moment, her eyes steady, her posture unchanged, but something deeper moving beneath the surface, something measured, something careful. Ethan did not interrupt that silence, did not rush it, for the first time allowing space where he would have once filled it. And in that pause, the imbalance that had defined the beginning of the room no longer existed, replaced by something more equal, more real, something that could not be undone. Naomi let the silence breathe before she moved, not stepping back, not stepping forward, just standing in the space she had earned, the light from the floor to ceiling windows catching softly along the edge of the table and reflecting across her face, steady and calm. Ethan did not look away, he did not rush her, and that alone said more than anything else he could have offered, because the man who once filled every pause now allowed one to exist, fully, without control. Around them, the room remained still, no one interrupting, no one reclaiming the conversation. The earlier structure of authority now replaced by something quieter, something that held its weight without needing to prove it. Naomi's eyes shifted briefly to the contract, then back to him, not out of hesitation, but consideration, as if she was measuring not the offer, but the moment itself, what it meant, what it would become. Her hand rested lightly against the edge of the table, fingers relaxed, grounded, the faint coolness of the surface anchoring her in the present. And when she finally spoke, her voice carried the same clarity it had from the beginning. unchanged by everything that had happened. "I did not speak to stay," she said, not defensive, not distant, simply honest, the words settling gently but firmly between them. Ethan absorbed it without interruption, his expression shifting just slightly, not in rejection, but in understanding, as if he recognized that what stood in front of him was not someone seeking position, but someone who had already chosen principle. Naomi continued, "I spoke because it needed to be said, and there was no emphasis, no attempt to persuade, only truth, simple and unadorned." The room held that truth in silence, the kind that did not resist, only accepted. Ethan nodded once, slowly, the movement small but deliberate, acknowledging not just her words, but the weight behind them. And for a moment, neither of them moved, the distance between them no longer defined by power, but by something far more balanced, something that could not be undone by titles or roles. Then Naomi reached back for the tray she had set down earlier, lifting it with the same quiet control she had carried from the beginning, the glasses steady, untouched, as if time had paused around them. She adjusted her grip slightly, the faint sound of glass against metal barely audible, and turned just enough to align herself with the path she had come from, not rushed, not hesitant, simply certain. Ethan watched her, not with the urgency he once carried, but with a stillness that reflected understanding, the kind that comes too late to change the moment, but not too late to recognize it. No one spoke as she began to